Well, you might want to pay attention tonight because Bucky goes through this process. Fortunately, Tennessee is a very landlord-friendly state. So if you do run into problems, you can usually get them out in a timely manner, but you got to do it right. We got several handouts here, so we're going to go ahead and pass them around. You guys are getting a lot of paper tonight. How many of you are happy about getting handouts? Raise your hand. All right, give them a hand, everybody. You got a lot of information tonight. All right, Bucky, you want this podium forward?
This would be good.
You sure?
Yeah.
All right.
Walk people out here.
Gotcha. Well, I'm going to turn the stage over to you. Bucky Phillips, everybody, give him a hand.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Is the sound on well? Back in the back. Don, can you hear me? Good. Okay. The topic tonight is how to quickly get a bad tenant out of your property. The really only quick way to do that is really to hire a couple of Guidos and have them taken out in the middle of the night. That's really the only effective way to get them out real quick. But in order to follow the law and to do it legally, to keep yourself from being sued, you have to comply with a number of statutes. The main statute that you're going to have to comply with, let me move to this. Hold on just a second. It's the Uniform Residential Landlord-Tenant Act. That act applies only in 10 counties in the state of Tennessee. Shelby County is one of them. In order for that act to apply, there has to be a minimum of 75,000 residents in the county according to the 2010 or subsequent census. And Fayette and Tipton County are not covered by that act. So if you have any tenants in Fayette or Tipton County, you're not subject to this act. The evictions are typically and generally called FEDs down in General Sessions Court. That stands for Forcible Entry and Detainer. A forcible entry and detainer action is not something that typically a landlord files. It's broken down as to forcible entry and detainer or unlawful detainer. Landlords will be filing unlawful detainers. The form that they use across the state for what they call an FED says all of that, but you need to understand you're leasing the property to a tenant. That tenant has entered into the property peacefully, and it is only when they breach that lease or they come to the end of the term and fail to move out is then you are looking at an unlawful detainer and you're looking to evict that tenant from the property. Important things to have is obviously your lease is a critical point in the beginning of an eviction, because obviously before you lease to an individual, you want to have certain things in your lease that will help you deal with, one, when a breach occurs, like when the rent is due, how long is the rental, such other conditions as having pets, whether they can have pets. Some other issues deal with having the utilities on, having the utilities turned on in their name. You need to have that provision in your lease, which requires the tenant to put the utilities in their name. That is specifically required, and you need that if the utilities are in the landlord's name, because you want to tell them, and under the statute, and we'll get to that specifically, but under the statute, you can tell them if they don't have their utilities turned over in their name in 3 days, you're going to turn the utilities off in your name, and you're not in violation of the law for having done so. So it's important, but you have to have that provision in your lease. There's also, in the event that you have a waiver of notice of default in your lease regarding failure to pay rent, and you don't have to make a demand if you have a waiver of notice of default of failure to pay rent in your lease. If you don't, then you're going to have to comply with the Uniform Residential Landlord-Tenant Act about giving certain notices. There's a required 14-day notice for them to cure that non-payment of rent. There's also that 14-day notice regarding non-compliance issues. If the tenant is defacing the property, not dumping garbage out in front of the property or having unwelcome guests over at the property and disrupting the neighborhood, you have to send out a 14-day notice for that tenant to correct that activity. And if they don't, then you can terminate the lease and begin. But if you have a waiver, and you can have a waiver of this provision provided you have it in your lease, and it has to be a certain 12-point block print, and you in bold 12-point block print in order to have that in your lease, which is an effective way to avoid having to do that. We're going to get to that notice provision here shortly in this presentation. You can also have rules and regulations as a landlord. They can be either written directly into your lease, or you can have them as an attachment. You can refer to them and incorporate them by reference. And you can specify certain rules, conditions, and terms, and so forth, in which the tenant must conduct themselves, and you can have those as part of your lease. If they violate those terms, that's grounds for a breach, and therefore you can move to evict. And you can modify those rules during the term of the lease. There are certain rules that you have to comply with, and I'll cover those with you before you can enter into modifications. But you want to provide that in your lease, that you can modify these rules during the term of that lease. We've already covered the utilities, so I'm going to move on. And again, this is just a general quick overview. To file an eviction, to file a detainer warrant against an individual, it's going to run you about $100 in general sessions. It's actually $98.50 for one defendant, $99.50 for two defendants. Plus, that's just base cost, plus a process server fee if you use a private process server, or the cost of the sheriff, which will run it up about another $35. If you use a private process server, that may be about $45 to $50. But the thing about a private process server is critical. They will go repeatedly to the property address to try to get your tenant. The sheriff, the paper has to be processed through their civil division. It has to get to the district where the deputy is working in that address, and he will route that into his system. Well, he'll go to that property in about 10 days. Oh, they're not there. He's got to come back, try it again. It may be another week. So you're waiting to get this person served using the sheriff. Nothing wrong with the sheriff. They're good. They do a good job. But a private process server will go back in the morning, they'll go back in the afternoon, they'll go back in the evening to try to get that person served, because they don't get paid unless they get service. So it's an incentive for them to get that. So you want to use a private process server. There's some other issues if they don't get service on an individual that we'll address specifically. Again, this is an unlawful detainer action. Again, you've entered into this lease with a tenant. It's a peaceful entry. It becomes unpeaceful or when the tenant breaches one of the conditions, such as non-payment of rent or any of the other conditions contained in that lease, or they withhold possession at the end of the term of the lease and won't get out. Then you'll have to sue for possession, and you'll have to file that, and you can file that action in either the general sessions or the circuit court.